Welcome back to Little House on Laurel. Today I'm making honey oat sourdough bread, which is a delicious mix of unbleached all-purpose flour and rolled oats, and of course honey. Not only is it delicious, it's perfect for slicing and sandwiches and toast, and you're just gonna love it. This recipe is actually about 20% oats, rolled oats, and 80% flour as far as the dry ingredients go. This gives the crumb a fluffy, light texture of white bread, but the oats help give it some substance with the whole grain. It's really a perfect mix. If you're new to sourdough, I'd like to give you an example of a baking schedule because I know sometimes it can be confusing to figure out when to do which steps so it all works out. So I am going to be feeding my sourdough starter at about 2 p.m. this afternoon. And then tonight I'll come back on here and we will mix together all the ingredients for the dough and then let it ferment overnight. And that'll be around 8 or 9 o'clock tonight. It really depends on how long it takes for your starter to become active and bubbly. And that depends on your starter and the temperature in your house. So it's summertime right now, and it's a little warmer even in our house, even though we have the air conditioner. We don't keep it super cold in here. So 6 hours should be perfect for it to get active and bubbly. And then tomorrow morning around 7 or 8, I will check the dough, and if it's doubled in size, then I will move on to shaping the dough and letting it do a second ferment in the loaf pan. It should double in size again. That can take anywhere from 2 to 5 or 6 hours. So I'm estimating if I shape it at around 7, it should be done rising by noon and ready to bake. The ingredients that you need for honey oat sourdough bread are 2 cups of flour, unbleached all-purpose, 1/2 cup of rolled oats, 1 teaspoon of salt, 1/2 cup of honey, 2 tablespoons of butter softened, 1/2 cup of warm water, and 1 cup of your active sourdough starter. I also do an egg wash right before I bake it, and so for that you would need 1 egg and then some extra rolled oats to sprinkle on top. I'm just gonna show you how I feed my sourdough starter in case you're curious. So this definitely needs to be fed. It does have some liquid on top called hooch. I just stir that right back in, and it just gives a little bit more sourness to your starter. The last time I used this was probably about 4 or 5 days ago, and it's been sitting in the fridge so that I didn't have to feed it. If you leave it on the counter, you do have to feed it quite often. Now, I don't do exact measurements. I don't use a scale, but I do a 1-to-1 ratio. So if I'm doing 1/2 cup of flour, then I'll do 1/2 cup of water. I don't really measure it, like I said, because I've gotten used to being able to look at the consistency of the starter and knowing that that's where it should be. I put about 1 cup of flour in there, and I'm gonna get 1 cup of water. And just make sure that your water is warm but not hot. Now you're gonna mix it so that you mix in the original sourdough starter with the flour and water. I'm gonna try to get all of the flour incorporated so there aren't any pockets of dry flour in there. And you also don't really want a lot of lumps. It's okay if there's a little bit of lumps in there, but you want to try to get it pretty smooth. All right, that is the right consistency. It's kind of like thick, like pancake batter. Once you've fed your sourdough starter, you're just going to lightly cover it. You don't want to completely tighten the cap on it, and you're going to keep it at room temperature. I'll come check on it in about 4 to 5 hours. My sourdough starter is ready now so that we can start making the honey oat sourdough bread. I am sorry if the audio sounds bad. My microphone just broke, so I'm just using the microphone on my camera. We're going to mix in all of the ingredients into a stand mixer with a dough hook. I'm going to save the flour for last though, because depending on how wet the dough is, you might need a little less or a little more flour. I'm gonna pour in 1 cup of sourdough starter. I have half a cup of oats, 1/4 cup of honey, two tablespoons of softened butter, a teaspoon of salt, and I use Redmond's real salt. It's an ancient salt, but it's mined right here in the United States, and it's really good. 1/2 cup of warm water. You just don't want it hot because that can kill the starter. I'm gonna mix this up and then I'll add my flour. So I'll do the 1st cup, mix that in. And then I'll get another cup and I'll slowly add to it. You'll also need to scrape down the sides because there's flour sticking to the sides. Okay, I'll add about another 1/2 cup. Some more. You're looking for the dough to start forming into a ball and pulling away from the sides of the bowl. Mine's still a little sticky, so I'm gonna add some more flour. It's getting there. I'm gonna have to go over the 2 cups a little bit. Going to add a little bit at a time and then mix it and see how it goes. So once it's formed into a ball, this is getting there, but it's still really sticky. So as I let it knead, because you're going to want to let it knead for 5 to 10 minutes so it can develop its gluten structure and becomes stretchy, elastic, and smooth. While I'm doing that, if I see that it's starting to get too sticky, sticking to the bottom of the bowl, I will add a little bit of flour. Okay, see how this is sticking to the dough hook? It's a little bit smoother, so I am just gonna let this knead for 5 to 10 minutes, just adding a little bit of flour if it starts to stick. This is what it should look like when it's pulling away from the bowl. That looks good. So when it's developed enough of a gluten structure, you can do the Windowpane test. You take a piece of your dough and you stretch it thin, and if it is thin enough that you can see through it when you hold it up to a window, you can see the light, but it doesn't break, then you know that you've developed your gluten structure enough. It should also be able to form into a nice, smooth, elastic ball. Okay, I'm gonna grease the bowl. You could leave it in the bowl that you mixed it in, but I am going to be using that for something else today. So form it into a nice ball, place it in your grease bowl, turn it over so that both sides are greased, and then cover it with plastic wrap or beeswax wrap or something that will keep air from getting in there and drying it out, since it's going to be sitting on the countertop all night or for 12 hours or so. And then I cover it with a towel as well, just to help it stay warmer and have a better chance of rising overnight. This dough has been rising for about 11 hours. And I'm gonna just punch it down. I'm gonna remove it from the bowl, and we're gonna form it into a loaf. So I just want to flatten it out a little bit, get rid of any air bubbles. I'm gonna roll it into a log. You want it to be about the size of the bread pan. And then you can kind of tuck the edges under a little. All right, you're gonna cover this with a towel and let it rise until doubled again, which could be anywhere from 2 to 5 hours. Now that my dough has doubled again in size, I am going to make an egg wash by whisking 1 egg. And then I'm gonna brush the egg wash onto the loaf. I'm gonna make sure you do this gently so you don't deflate the dough. And then we'll sprinkle some oats on top. It just gives it a nice appearance, but it's also really nice when you're slicing your bread and your crust has some extra oats on it. Gives it some texture. So you can put as few or as many as you want on here. Now I'm going to bake this in the oven at 375 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes or until the crust is golden brown. I just removed the bread from the oven. You can see it's golden brown on top. I'm going to remove it and let it cool completely on the baker's rack. Our honey oat sourdough bread is cooled and ready for slicing. As you can see, it makes some really beautiful slices that are perfect for sandwiches or just to put butter on. If you're new to sourdough or you're still getting used to working with sourdough, I just want you to know that it's very forgiving. There might be times when it doesn't rise as much as you'd hoped, but you can still use the bread for different recipes. It'll still taste great, so you can still eat it. And then you'll learn from that lesson, and the next time you'll hopefully be able to fix your mistake. I think the hardest thing for me was learning that it takes more time to rise, and I need to plan sourdough into my schedule. If I know that bread is going to be part of our dinner, then I need to schedule the afternoon before to make sure that I feed my sourdough starter, and then the night before I will mix up all the ingredients and let it ferment overnight. It also just takes a long time for sourdough to do its ferments and to rise naturally, because it's a different kind of yeast than the store-bought yeast. It's a natural yeast, and it just takes longer. But it's so worth it for the wonderful depth of flavor that sourdough provides. I think you're going to fall in love with it if you haven't already. It's so satisfying to know that your sourdough starter, the care that you've put into it to feed it regularly and to use it, has helped you to provide this bread for yourself and your family. Not only that, but sourdough is full of health benefits for you and your family. And I'm sure that you know several of those, but it contains more minerals and nutrients. It's easier to digest. It won't raise your blood sugar as high or as quickly as regular bread because it has a lower glycemic index. It's oftentimes better for those who are gluten sensitive because fermenting your sourdough helps to break down the gluten in the bread into smaller amino acids that your body can digest. Sourdough is also a wonderful form of healthy bacteria called lactobacillus, which you can find in things like yogurt and other fermented foods. It's important for your gut health. Not only that, but lactobacillus creates higher levels of lactic acid in your body, and because those levels are higher, there's less room for phytic acid, which is more dangerous for your health. Healthy bacteria in sourdough bread helps to reduce the yeast in your bread, which means there's less likelihood that you will have a high level of yeast in your body, which can result in an infection. There's definitely less preservatives when you make your own sourdough bread. You won't have the preservatives that are put into store-bought bread in order to keep it from going bad. One of my favorite things about sourdough bread is that it's natural. It's been used for a very long time. Your own grandparents or great-grandparents were probably sourdough savvy, and it's just been a lost art, which I think is making a comeback, and that's a wonderful thing that we're taking charge of our food and our health. And I hope that you will find the information you need here on my YouTube channel. You can also go to my blog, littlehouseonlaurel.com. I have lots of recipes on there, and if you have any questions or comments, please put them below. If you're just getting started with sourdough, you might have some questions when you're having some issues. One of those questions is, what happens if you let your sourdough rise too long? And usually if you let it over rise, when you try to form it into a ball after the first rise, then it will deflate and you'll be left with a sticky mess that's really hard to manage. You might have issues with dense bread, and that can be tricky because there's several different things that could cause your bread to be dense. One of those could be that you didn't let your sourdough rise long enough. With sourdough, we just need to really give it more time and let it do its work. That's why you'll see in my recipe that I've added several hours onto what normal bread would take to rise. Another thing is that depending on the temperature of your home, it may take longer or it might take less time than my home would for my sourdough starter to rise. Also, within my own home, in the summer, things rise more quickly on the countertop than in the winter when it's just a colder temperature inside. So you'll need to take all of those things into account when you are rising your bread. Another issue could be if your sourdough starter wasn't fully active when you started your recipe. You want your starter to be bubbly, which usually means that it's been fed within the last 4 to 10 hours, which would also depend on the temperature of your home. So this will take longer if it's cooler inside. Also, if you feed your starter, but then you let it go too long, you might miss that window where it's active, and if you try to make a recipe, it just won't rise as well. So if you want to test this out, what you can do is scoop some of your sourdough starter into a glass of water. And if it sinks to the bottom, that means that it is not at its prime. So either it hasn't gone long enough since you fed it, or it's gone too long. If the sourdough starter floats on top of the water, then you know that it is ready to use in your recipe. Another cause of dense sourdough bread could be that you added too much flour. This is why in my recipe, I add flour last so that I can control how much I put in depending on how wet my dough is. If there's too much flour, then it will be too stiff of a dough and it won't be as elastic and won't rise as well. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you'll try making honey oat sourdough sandwich bread. If you make it and enjoyed it, I would love if you commented below and let me know. Make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel and share it with your friends. Also, if you'd like the printable recipe, you can find the link to my blog post in the description box. I hope you'll come back soon. I add 2 new videos every week with lots of content on farm fresh recipes and simple living tips to inspire you on your journey to a healthy and happy home.